On April 22, 1912, sailors aboard the ship Mackay Bennett, drifting in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, hooked another shapeless object with a gaff. It was body number 124. In the ship's log, the coroner recorded the dry facts. The man was wearing a blue serge suit, a blue embroidered handkerchief, and a gold belt with a buckle. His face was covered in soot, his jaw slightly damaged, but his features remained recognizable. The most interesting discovery came when they cut open the soaked pocket fabric. There lay a gold watch, a gold pencil, diamond cufflinks, and a wad of soaked banknotes. $2,440. To grasp the scale of this sum, that same year, a third-class ticket on the Titanic cost $30. An ordinary American worker built a house for his family for $500. The sum in the dead man's pocket equaled the cost of 5 such houses, or about $75,000 at 2024 rates. Just pocket change for an evening. Money that couldn't buy a seat in a lifeboat. Money that was now drying on the deck of the rescue ship, while its owner lay in a canvas bag. This man was John Jacob Astor IV, a 47-year-old colonel, inventor, writer, and, most importantly, owner of the lion's share of Manhattan Island real estate. At the moment his heart stopped from hypothermia, his personal fortune was valued at $87 million. In today's money, that's more than $2.5 billion. He was richer than many European kings, whose daughters his family appraised like prize mares. But the irony of fate lay not in the iceberg. The true tragedy of the Astor dynasty occurred not in the ocean, but in the luxurious drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue, long before the Titanic's demise. John Jacob died like a hero, yielding his place to women and children, but his life was destroyed by a war waged not by generals, but by 2 women in corsets that strangled tighter than the icy water. This story is not about business. If you're looking for secrets of success, close this video. The Astors didn't create a product that changed the world, like Ford or Jobs. Their main product was arrogance. This is the story of how one family, possessing resources that could buy a small country, spent decades and hundreds of millions of dollars to settle one single question. Who among them had the right to be called Mrs. Astor? Imagine the level of toxicity when a nephew tears down his own mansion just to build a 13-story hotel in its place and block the sunlight from his own aunt's windows. Imagine hating your relatives so much that you're willing to emigrate to another country and fake your own death just to avoid reading about them in the newspapers. We look at black and white photographs of people in top hats and think their lives were prim and boring. That's a lie. Their lives were like the TV series Succession, only without breaks or security. They used architecture like artillery. They turned marriages into corporate mergers and children into hostages of ambition. Today, walking through New York, you see traces of this war without even suspecting it. You may have heard of the legendary Waldorf Astoria Hotel. You know this brand as a symbol of ultimate luxury. But few know that this hotel is a scar. It's a monument to family hatred. Its very name, consisting of 2 parts joined by a hyphen, is the result of a truce between 2 warring camps that first tried to destroy each other, then realized that money smells just as pleasantly, even if it's obtained from an enemy. We will begin our investigation not with the birth of the founder, but with understanding the price that had to be paid for the ticket to history. Astor, on the deck of the Mackay Bennett, is the final score. But to understand how such figures appeared in this score, we need to rewind time back. We need to descend from the deck of the sinking liner to the dirty streets of late 18th century New York, reeking of manure and fresh blood. To the place where the first Astor, a man with the face of a bird of prey and the heart of an accountant, made the first dollar on which this cursed pyramid of gold was built. Welcome to the Gilded Age, the era when a calling card could cost a life, and the absence of an invitation to a ball was equivalent to social execution. To understand why the Astor heirs went mad from idleness and drowned each other in gold, we need to look at the man who mined that gold. And believe me, there wasn't a drop of that aristocratic refinement in John Jacob Astor I that his great-grandchildren were so proud of. If you met him on a New York street in the early 19th century, you would most likely cross to the other side. He smelled not of French perfume, but of mustiness, raw wool, and the blood of slaughtered animals. The story of America's greatest fortune began not in a bank, but on a slaughterhouse floor in rural Germany. Johann Jacob Astor was born in Waldorf, in a butcher's family. Remember this: the blood of New York's kings flowed from people who had been chopping meat for centuries. No coats of arms, no titles, just a knife, an apron, and the ability to survive. When he arrived in America in 1784, right after the Revolutionary War, he had 7 flutes in his pocket that he hoped to sell, and 5 pounds sterling. His first business was fur. And this wasn't trading beautiful furs in a bright salon. This was dirty, brutal work. Astor would go into the forests for weeks, bargaining with Indians, buying beaver skins for next to nothing to resell them in London with 1,000% markup. Beaver top hats were the height of fashion in Europe at the time. In fact, Astor built the foundation of his wealth on destroying the beaver population in North America. He was ruthless. When competitors tried to stand in his way, he dumped prices, ruined them, and then bought their businesses for pennies. In his accounting books from that era, there are records of opium deals. He didn't scruple to ship drugs to China if it brought profit. Morality was a word from the dictionary of losers for him. But Astor's true genius showed not in the forests, but in the swamps. At that time, New York ended somewhere around the current City Hall. Everything north of there was farms, rocks, and swamps. Astor, with the nose of a predator, understood one thing that others didn't see. Manhattan Island is bounded by water. There will be no more land. But there are more and more people. He began buying land. He bought farms on the sites where the Times Square skyscrapers stand today. He bought swamps that are now known as Harlem. They laughed at him. Newspaper columnists wrote satires about the mad German who spent money on dirt far from civilization. Once, he bought the Medden farm for $25,000. A few years later, he sold a tiny piece of this land just to lay out a street for $100,000. His strategy was brilliantly simple and monstrously effective. It was called land lease rights. Astor almost never sold land. Why sell the goose that lays the golden eggs? He leased it out for 21 years. The terms were draconian. The tenant had to build a house at his own expense, pay all taxes, maintain the street, and upon expiration of the lease, the house passed to Astor's ownership. In fact, other people built New York with their own money, only to gift it to Astor. He became the first multimillionaire in the history of the United States. He was called the Landlord of New York. At the same time, in everyday life, the founder was pathologically stingy. A man who could buy the entire city checked candle bills until the end of his life. There is evidence that even as the richest man in the country, He wiped his hands on the tablecloth or his own clothes during lunch if there were no guests. He wore the same clothes for years. He was not interested in balls, art, or charity. He was only interested in the numbers in the ledger. He died in 1848. At the time of his death, his fortune was valued at $20 million. So you understand the scale. It was 1/150th part of the entire gross national product of the United States at that time. If recalculated to today's economy, his fortune would be equivalent to $170 billion. That's the level of Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. But he left his descendants something more terrible than money. He left them a mindset paradigm. In his will and instructions, he hammered one thought into their heads: never sell land. He created trust funds that shackled his children and grandchildren hand and foot. They became the keepers of the golden cage. And here the tragedy begins. The second and third generations of Astors received the keys to a city they did not build. They received millions for which they did not shed a drop of sweat. The founding father was a rough, tough brute who knew the value of every cent because he remembered the smell of blood at the slaughterhouse. His grandchildren would know only the smell of orchids and printer's ink on fresh stock certificates. The contrast was striking. John Jacob Astor I lived for accumulation. He was an engine, a creator, albeit a cynical one. His descendants would become consumers. The energy that Grandpa spent conquering the continent would be spent by them destroying each other in drawing rooms. The money accumulated over decades of hard labor and risk would become fuel for the most expensive and senseless social war in American history. The founder died, believing he had created a dynasty for the ages. He could not imagine that the main threat to his empire would come not from the market, not from revolution, and not from competitors. The threat would be born in his own family. And the first warning bell will be the appearance of women who decide that the surname Astor is not just an entry in the real estate registry, but a royal title worth killing for. The death of the founder did not stop the flow of money. On the contrary, it opened the floodgates. If John Jacob I was a pump extracting money from the city, then his son, William Backhouse Astor, became the ideal guardian of the reservoir. He was called the landlord, a boring, dry man who came to the office on Prince Street every morning and sat there until evening, recounting the rent payments. He doubled his father's fortune, bringing it to $40 million, but never learned to enjoy it. The real explosion happened when the third generation took the stage, the grandchildren. These were people who had never seen beaver pelts and did not know the smell of the slaughterhouse. They grew up in a world where money appeared by itself, like air. By the mid-19th century, New York began to grow rapidly upward and outward, and every new brick laid by a worker immigrant brought the Astor clan a few cents. They no longer needed to work. They needed to figure out how to spend what was impossible to spend. It was at this moment that America entered an era that Mark Twain would call, with biting irony, the Gilded Age. Not golden, notice, but gilded. The difference is colossal. The Golden Age is purity and prosperity. The Gilded Age is a thin layer of shiny paint hiding rotten wood. It was a time when outward glamour became more important than substance, and morality finally gave way to vanity. At the center of this glamour was a couple whose marriage was supposed to be a union of equals, but turned into a catalyst for the future war. The founder's grandson, William Backhouse Astor Jr., married a girl named Caroline Webster Schermerhorn. Remember this surname, Schermerhorn. For New York at that time, it sounded louder than Astor. The Astors were rich, but they were considered parvenus, descendants of a butcher. The Schermerhorns were Dutch aristocracy, first settlers whose lineage was impeccable. Caroline married William not for money, she had her own. She brought to the Astor family something that couldn't be bought for dollars: legitimacy. She gave them blue blood. And as soon as these two capitals, financial and social, united, an arms race in the field of luxury began. They no longer lived in modest townhouses. They began building palaces. Life turned into an endless performance. Caroline, possessing a steel character and a complete lack of sense of humor, decided that her mission was to create a royal court in America, which this democratic country had never had. And the Queen, of course, had to be her. She introduced the fashion for absurd luxury. Her favorite adornment was the so-called corsage, a wide ribbon completely covered in diamonds, which was attached to the bodice of the dress. It was literally armor made of precious stones. They said that one of her outfits had so many carats that under bright gas lighting, it hurt to look at her. She wore tiaras that surpassed the crowns of some European monarchs in size and cost. But behind this facade, rot was already beginning to show. While Caroline was building herself up as the queen of society, her husband, William Backhouse Jr., was frankly bored. Balls, etiquette, and his wife's ambitions meant nothing to him. He was a typical product of the third generation, a man without a purpose. His only passions became alcohol, horses, and yachts. He built himself a huge steam yacht, Ambassadress, the largest private yacht in the world at the time. It was a floating palace where he escaped from his domineering wife. Persistent rumors circulated in society that orgies took place on board this yacht, about which decent people spoke only in whispers. William disappeared at sea for weeks, entertained himself with women of dubious reputation, and drank whiskey by the case, while Caroline stood in her ballroom, straight as a stick, pretending she had a perfect family. This was classic hypocrisy of the Gilded Age. Outside, marble, velvet, and impeccable manners. Inside, coldness, alienation, and loneliness. Husband and wife lived virtually separately. William became just a wallet for Caroline's ambitions. He paid the bills but had no say. Meanwhile, the second branch of the family, the descendants of William's older brother, John Jacob III, watched this with growing irritation. They also had money. They also had ambitions. And they believed that they were the main Astors, since they descended from the eldest son. But Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the wife of the younger brother, behaved as if the only Mrs. Astor was her. She even ordered calling cards printed that simply said, Mrs. Astor, without a name, without her husband's initials, just Mrs. Astor, as if she were the only woman in the world bearing that surname. All other women in the family had to write Mrs. John Jacob Astor or Mrs. William Astor. This was a slap in the face. A quiet, paper, but deafening slap to the entire family. By the end of the 19th century, the situation had heated up to the limit. Money flowed like a river from the slums of Lower Manhattan, where thousands of immigrants lived in horrific, cramped conditions, paying rent to the Astors. And on Fifth Avenue, this money turned into diamond collars, closed clubs, and hatred. The stage was set for the great battle. All that remained was to wait for another woman in the family to appear, with the same steel character as Caroline, who would refuse to bow her head. And this woman was already on the approach. The war did not begin with a cannon shot, but with a tiny piece of thick cardboard, a calling card. In the world of New York's elite at the end of the 19th century, This rectangle of paper was the most important document. It weighed more than $1 million bank check. If the butler accepted your card and placed it on a silver tray in the entrance hall of the right house, you existed. If they returned it to you, or worse still, forgot to respond, you were socially dead. You could be as rich as Croesus, but for New York, you were a ghost. The conflict that tore the Astor dynasty apart ignited over ink. Caroline Astor, our self-proclaimed queen, made a decision that today seems the height of pettiness, but back then it was a political statement. After her husband's death, she ordered the removal of any initials from the calling cards. No more Mrs. William Astor, just 2 words, Mrs. Astor. With this gesture, she declared, "In this clan, in this city, and in this universe, there is only one main woman. Me." But in the house next door, literally behind the wall, lived another woman, Mary Mamie Astor. She was the wife of William Waldorf Astor, Caroline's nephew, and according to the laws of lineage and patriarchy, it was her husband who was now the head of the Astor family. His father had been the older brother. He himself was the eldest man in the line. Therefore, the title Mrs. Astor rightfully belonged to Mary. This was Game of Thrones in corsets. William Waldorf flew into a rage. He was a heavy, touchy, and incredibly proud man. He went to his aunt and demanded she observe the hierarchy. Caroline looked at him the way one looks at a footman who served warm champagne and refused to change anything. For her, Mary was just the nephew's wife, a nice but insignificant detail. New York held its breath. Society split. Postmen were run off their feet, confusing letters. Invitations got lost. But the power was on Caroline's side. Why? Because she had a superweapon named Ward McAllister. McAllister was the strangest character in this drama. A failed lawyer who turned snobbery into a profession. He became Caroline's right hand, her prime minister, and chief executioner. It was he who uttered the phrase that became a death sentence for thousands of rich families. There are only about 400 people in New York who really matter. If you go beyond that number, you'll find yourself among people who either don't know how to behave in a ballroom or don't know how to leave it. Why 400? Magic of numbers? No. Exactly that many people, 400, fit in Caroline Astor's ballroom in her mansion on Fifth Avenue, number 350. This was a brilliant and cruel system of artificial scarcity. Hundreds of millionaires lived in New York, but there were only 400 seats on Olympus. People went mad trying to get on this list. McAllister and Caroline personally crossed out names. Divorce? Out. Made money on railroads instead of inheriting it? Out. Jewish origin? Out. Mary and William Waldorf found themselves trapped. They had money, the status of head of the family, but social power had been usurped by the aunt. Every ball that Caroline gave was a demonstration of power. She stood in the center of the hall, under her portrait by Carolus Duran, draped in diamonds, and accepted bows. And Mary in the neighboring house could only hear the music drifting through the walls. This was exquisite humiliation. But the social war was waged not only within the family. Outside, the Astor fortress was besieged by new money. The most striking example was the Vanderbilt family. The Astors considered them vulgar upstarts. Old Cornelius Vanderbilt also started with fairies, just as the first Astor did with furs. But for Caroline, their money was too fresh. She ignored Alva Vanderbilt's existence for years, a woman whose ambitions could move mountains. In 1883, Alva delivered a counterstrike that made it into the textbooks of social warfare. She built a palace at 660 Fifth Avenue and announced a grand costume ball. The whole city talked about nothing else. Caroline's daughter, young Carrie Astor, was preparing a special dance, Quadrille of the Stars, and anticipated triumph. And then Alva made her move. A few days before the ball, she regretfully announced that she could not invite Miss Carrie Astor, as Mrs. Astor, Caroline, had never paid a visit to the Vanderbilts' house. And according to etiquette rules, one cannot invite to the house those who have not been introduced to the hostess. This was checkmate. Carrie sobbed. Caroline faced a choice: principles or her daughter's happiness. And for the first time in her life, Iron Lena blinked. She ordered the carriage to be harnessed. That day, the residents of Fifth Avenue witnessed a historic event. The Astor's carriage, with footmen in blue liveries, stopped at the doors of the upstart Vanderbilt. Caroline's footman climbed the steps and left that very calling card on Alva's silver tray. Caroline capitulated to the new money to save face. But before her own family, she had no intention of retreating even an inch. William Waldorf, watching this circus, realized that playing by his aunt's rules was pointless. She had rewritten the rules for herself. She controlled the guest lists. She had turned his wife into a shadow. His hatred reached critical mass. He decided that if he couldn't beat her at her own game, he would destroy the playing field. A revenge plan ripened in his head, so grand and petty at the same time that it would forever change the face of New York. He looked at his mansion, standing wall to wall with his aunt's house, and decided to tear it down. Not to build something better for living, but to build a commercial structure that would become a nightmare for Caroline. He decided to house not aristocrats next to her, but travelers. He decided to build a hotel. This was unheard of. At that time, hotels were considered places for the temporary stay of traveling salesmen. Building a hotel next to the residence of Mrs. Astor was tantamount to opening a public toilet under Queen Victoria's windows. This was a declaration of total war. William Waldorf was ready to sacrifice his own home, his family nest, just to poison the life of the woman who had stolen the title from his wife. The social war was entering the phase of architectural terror. While positional war raged on Fifth Avenue between aunt and nephew, a new phenomenon appeared on the horizon that would forever change the rules of the game. American millionaires realized that in the United States, they had hit the ceiling. They had money that could buy the whole world, but in the eyes of old Europe, they remained fur traders and railroad builders. Their blood was considered too red, too lively and coarse. They needed blue blood, and they decided to buy it, just as they bought old masters' paintings or antique statues. The era of the dollar princesses began. This was the most cynical and large-scale export of live commodities in the history of the elite. The scheme was simple to the point of nausea. On one side of the Atlantic were American fathers with checkbooks, ready to pay millions so that their grandchildren would be born with titles. On the other side were British dukes and French counts whose ancestral castles were crumbling, roofs leaking, and estates mortgaged multiple times over. European aristocracy was rich in history, but bankrupt in fact. America was rich in fact, but poor in history. This was the perfect deal. Cash in exchange for a crown. Although the Astor family considered itself above this market, the very atmosphere of the Gilded Age forced them to react. Their main competitors, the Vanderbilts, played this card with a cruelty worthy of an ancient tragedy. The story of Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough became the benchmark of this madness. Consuelo's mother, Alva, the very one who humiliated Caroline Astor, literally locked her daughter in a room and threatened to kill herself if she didn't marry the Duke. The contract was signed by lawyers. The price tag? $2.5 million in cash as a dowry. In 2024 terms, that's about $90 million, plus an annual rent. For this money, the Duke got repairs for his Blenheim Palace, and the Vanderbilts got a duchess title for their daughter and the right to sit at dinner next to Queen Victoria. At the wedding, the bride cried so hard that her face had to be covered with a thick veil so guests wouldn't see her swollen eyes. This was not a wedding. This was a corporate merger where the daughter served as collateral. How did this affect the Astors? Directly. William Waldorf Astor, losing the war to his Aunt Caroline in New York, closely watched this transatlantic bazaar. He understood one thing. In America, he would always be the nephew. In America, democracy, even if nominal, prevented him from feeling like a king. His hatred for New York, for its press, for its brazen immigrants, and above all, for Mrs. Astor, reached its zenith. And then he made a move that shocked the nation. He decided not just to marry off his daughter for a title, he decided to buy a title for himself. In 1893, William Waldorf Astor declared, "America is no place for a gentleman." He packed his bags, loaded his art collections, family, and checkbook onto a ship, and sailed to England. Forever. This was the greatest betrayal in the eyes of the American press. A man whose fortune was built on land rents in New York abandoned his country. Newspapers called him a deserter. But William didn't care. He arrived in London with one goal: to become a greater aristocrat than the British themselves. He bought the Cliveden estate, a luxurious palace on the Thames. But that wasn't enough. He bought Hever Castle, the ancestral home of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII. Imagine the level of ambition. An American buys the house of an executed queen, invests $10 million in it, hundreds of millions today, creates an artificial lake and Italian gardens there just to show the local lords what real money is. He wanted a title, but the British system was conservative. Titles weren't sold openly like potatoes. They had to be earned. And William began spending. He donated huge sums to charity, supported political parties, bought newspapers, including the legendary Observer, to influence public opinion. He behaved like a spoiled child in a toy store who wants to buy the seller himself. The local aristocrats laughed at him behind his back. They gladly drank his wine, ate at his banquets, enjoyed his hospitality at Cliveden, but considered him a vulgar wallet. They called him Wally. But William was persistent. His goal was to rub it in the nose of that very Mrs. Astor left behind in New York. He wanted his status confirmed by the king, not by a society lady in a diamond corsage. In the end, he achieved it, but the price was monstrous, not only in money, but also in human dignity. In 1916, he received the title of Baron and then Viscount. He became Lord Astor. But by that time, he had turned into a deeply lonely, paranoid old man who barricaded himself in his castle, surrounded by a moat and a high wall. Meanwhile, in New York, his cousin Caroline's son, John Jacob Astor IV, the future Titanic victim, was also seeking happiness in marriage, but on the other side of the ocean. And this marriage became yet another illustration of the fact that money can't buy love, but but it can buy very expensive hatred. He married Ava Lowly Willing, a girl of incredible beauty and equally incredible coldness. It was a union of two statues. Ava despised her husband, despised his hobbies, despised his spinelessness. She married the name and the bank account. At their reception, such an icy atmosphere reigned that guests joked they needed to wear fur coats. Thus, by the beginning of the 20th century, the Astor dynasty split into two branches. The English branch, which bought itself a seat in the House of Lords and hid behind castle walls, and the American branch, which continued to rule in New York, but was rotting from within due to unhappy marriages and lack of real purpose. They surrounded themselves with coats of arms, titles, and an army of servants. But, as we will see further, no footman can protect the master from the emptiness that settled in their huge, echoing corridors. And it is the houses, these stone monsters they built, that will become the main witnesses to their downfall. If you think that life in the Astor mansion was like a Disney fairy tale, you are deeply mistaken. These houses were not built for living. There was no coziness in our understanding. You couldn't lounge on the sofa with a book or walk to the kitchen in pajamas for a glass of water. These buildings were machines. Machines for producing awe, envy, and social dominance. And, like any complex mechanism, they ground up those who got inside. Let's enter the Holy of Holies, the Caroline Astor Mansion on Fifth Avenue. The first thing that struck a guest crossing the threshold was the silence and cold. Not temperature cold, although heating such volumes was a titanic task, but aesthetic. The walls were lined not with wood, but with marble. The floors, mosaic, on which the click of heels echoed like gunshots. A huge staircase, intended not for ascending to the second floor, but for the hostess's theatrical descent to the guests. Everything was designed so that a person felt small and insignificant against the backdrop of the greatness of the Astor name. The furniture in the drawing rooms was French, from the era of the Louis. Beautiful, gilded, upholstered in silk, and absolutely unsuitable for sitting. The chair backs were straight like gravestones. On them, one could only maintain posture. This was architecture of discipline. Even the chairs demanded that you meet standards. But the real life of this house was hidden from view. To maintain the illusion of magic, where food appears by itself and dust disappears before it settles, an army was required. Caroline Astor's staff consisted of more than 30 servants just for the city house. This was a state within a state, with its own rigid hierarchy. At the top of the pyramid stood the butler, a man feared more than the mistress herself. He managed the wine cellar and silver. Below were the footmen. The Astors required footmen to be tall, slender, and silent. They dressed them in blue liveries that copied the uniforms of servants in Windsor Castle. They were living statues. They were forbidden to speak unless addressed. They were forbidden to sneeze, cough, or show any signs of life in the presence of the masters. Down in the basements, the work of laundresses, cooks, and scullery maids boiled. Bed linen was changed daily. Newspapers were ironed before being served to Mr. Astor, so that the printer's ink wouldn't stain white gloves, and so that the paper was warm and crisp. Coins given as tips were pre-washed in soapy solution. The Astor's money had to shine, even in the literal sense. But the most terrifying place in this house was the ballroom. Imagine a room capable of holding 400 people. Huge chandeliers of rock crystal, each weighing half a ton. Walls hung with canvases of old masters, bought in Europe not out of love for art, but on the advice of consultants. When a ball roared here, the hall seemed the center of the universe. Diamonds sparkled, champagne flowed like a river. The air was thick with the scents of expensive perfumes and the smell of orchids. But when the music died down and guests dispersed, the house turned into a tomb. Loneliness in such a space is felt physically. Imagine Caroline Astor standing in the middle of an empty hall of hundreds of square meters. The sound of her own steps frightens. Huge mirrors reflect only her, multiplying loneliness in geometric progression. The house was designed for a crowd. Without spectators, the scenery lost meaning. The dining table was another instrument of torture. Service for 100 people, gold dishware, not gilded, but pure gold. The plates were so heavy that footmen had to have extraordinary physical strength to change the courses. Dinner lasted for hours, 12, 14 courses. Turtle soup, oysters, game, sorbets. And all this time, one had to engage in small talk, avoiding sharp topics. Children in this house grew up like exotic plants in a greenhouse, in warmth, but under glass. They were raised by governesses and nannies. Seeing parents was by schedule, 1 hour after lunch. John Jacob Astor IV grew up in a world where emotional closeness was a sign of weakness. He learned to understand mechanisms and machines better than people because machines were more honest. A steam turbine works by the laws of physics, not by a mother's whim. The Astors became hostages of their own concrete and marble. They built walls to fence themselves off from the rabble, from the city, from the dirt. But in the end, they walled themselves in. Their bedrooms were the size of ordinary people's apartments, but they slept in them alone. Husbands and wives had separate apartments, often in different wings of the house, meeting only in corridors or at official receptions. It was precisely in these echoing corridors that the very rot was born, which we will discuss further. Boredom. Total, soul-corroding boredom of people who had everything, but nothing real. When you can't go to the store because it's indecent. When you can't simply stroll in the park without a footman escort. When every step, every breath is regulated by a protocol invented by your own mother. The Astor mansions were magnificent from the outside. Tourists stopped to admire the stone carvings and wrought iron grills. But inside, they were luxury, solitary confinement cells. And the higher the walls rose, the thinner the psyche of those living inside became. The golden cage remained a cage, even if the bars were inlaid with rubies. Behind the shining facade of the mansions, behind the diamond necklaces that were supposed to protect from the crowd's gazes, and behind the titles bought for a song, lurked rot. And it ate away at the Astors from the inside, like acid. When you have everything, literally everything that can be bought for money, the only challenge left is yourself. And few heirs withstood this test. Boredom. The total absence of any need to do anything, except maintain the appearance of well-being, led to the most unexpected and destructive consequences. John Jacob Astor III, the founder's son, though boring as an accountant's report, at least lived his life without major scandals. But his son, William Backhouse Astor Jr., Caroline's husband, became the true embodiment of the third-generation problem. He hated his life, his wife, his city. The only things that brought him joy were alcohol and women. His multi-deck yacht, Ambassadress, became a symbol of his despair. He spent months on it, leaving Caroline alone in the cold palace on Fifth Avenue. Rumors circulated that such things happened on this yacht, that even the most dissolute Parisian courtesan would shudder. They spoke of drunken orgies, of women he brought from port cities, dancers, actresses, just available girls. Caroline, like a true queen, pretended nothing was happening. Her reputation was more important than family well-being. but this silence devoured her from the inside. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, the future Titanic passenger, was also no paragon of virtue. His first wife, Helen, was young, beautiful, and, judging by everything, deeply unhappy. She suffered from tuberculosis, but many biographers hint that her suffering was caused not only by the disease, but also by her husband's icy attitude. She died at the age of 26. At her funeral, John Jacob behaved so detachedly that he was accused of lacking any feelings. A year after her death, he was already actively courting his second wife, Ava. And this story with the Titanic. He bought a first-class ticket, but when the sinking began, he helped his pregnant wife Ava board a lifeboat, while he himself remained on the sinking ship. His body was found. He was a man of honor, but at what price? The price of this honor was his own life, and the life of his unborn child, who never saw the light of day. But the brightest example of decay was William Waldorf Astor, the very one who tore down his house to build the Waldorf Hotel and humiliate his aunt. After emigrating to England and buying the title of Baron, he became obsessed with his Cliveden estate. He spent unimaginable sums on its maintenance, but at the same time was so paranoid and reclusive that he hardly left his room. His wife, Mary, suffered from loneliness and, as whispered in London salons, had affairs. William Waldorf himself, having obtained the title, could never shake the feeling that he was just an American with money. He became suspicious, withdrawn, afraid of assassinations and poisonings. He died in 1991, leaving his son, Waldorf, not only the title, but also a whole collection of phobias. Waldorf Astor, the second Viscount Astor, became the embodiment of the end of an era. A man whose fortune was counted in hundreds of millions of pounds, he proved completely unfit for life. He suffered from alcoholism and depression. There is evidence that he attempted suicide. In the end, he died of a sleeping pill overdose at the age of 48. His death in 1959 effectively put an end to the history of the male line of Astors, who played a notable role in world politics and business. The heirs were poisoned by wealth. The money that John Jacob I earned with sweat and blood became poison for his descendants. They lost touch with reality. They forgot what need is, what labor is. They didn't need to achieve anything because everything was already theirs. And this everything turned out to be an unbearable burden. The public, initially admiring their wealth, began to see the cracks. Scandals, even carefully concealed ones, seeped through the cracks. Divorces, drunkenness, early death. All this indicated that behind the golden gilding lurked emptiness. The Astors ceased to be a symbol of success. They became a symbol of warning, a symbol of what happens when money becomes the only goal, the only value. This internal rot, this existential crisis of wealth, led to the main event that became the final chord in this grand family drama. The event that deprived the family of one of its brightest representatives and finally destroyed the myth of the Astors' invulnerability. By 1911, John Jacob Astor IV committed an act that shocked New York more than any financial bankruptcy. At 47, he divorced his icy wife, Ava, and married Madeline Force. Madeline was 18 years old. She was younger than his son. New York exploded in outrage. Priests refused to marry the couple. Newspapers drew caricatures. The society ruled by his own mother, Caroline, closed its doors to him. To escape the poison of gossip, the couple went on a long trip to Europe and Egypt. It was exile disguised as a honeymoon. But in the winter of 1912, it turned out that Madeline was pregnant. John Jacob decided that his child should be born in America. They needed to return. They chose the safest, most luxurious, and fastest way to cross the Atlantic. They bought tickets on the Titanic's maiden voyage. The cost of their ticket was £247 sterling. That's about $60,000 today. For that money, they got not just a cabin, but personal apartments with their own promenade deck. Traveling with them were a valet, a maid, a nurse, and an Airedale terrier named Kitty. On the evening of the 14th of April, John Jacob dined in the à la carte restaurant. He was calm. He was one of the richest people on the planet, and the world around him was built to satisfy his whim. When the ship hit the iceberg, Astor at first didn't attach any importance to it. He even joked, saying to one of the passengers, "I ordered ice, but this is too much." But soon, reality began to seep through the hull. When it became clear that the ship was doomed, Astor led the pregnant Madeline to the lifeboats. And here, on the boat deck, a scene occurred that is the culmination of the entire dynasty's history. This was the moment of truth. All the money, all the titles, all the mansions on Fifth Avenue, all this social war, all of it instantly devalued. Only cold physics and human morality remained. They approached lifeboat number 4. Madeline had difficulty moving because of her belly and the 7 layers of clothing worn for warmth. Astor helped her climb over the rail. Then he turned to the officer supervising the loading. It was Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Astor asked if he could board the lifeboat with his wife, considering her delicate condition. Ponder this moment. Before the officer stands a man who could buy the entire White Star Line shipping company, a man accustomed to his word being law. But Lightoller looked at him and uttered the phrase that became a sentence. "No men in the boats until the women are loaded, sir." Astor did not argue. He did not offer a bribe. He did not shout, "Do you know who I am?" He simply nodded. He asked for the lifeboat number to find his wife later. Then he put on his gloves, lit a cigarette, and walked away. The last time he was seen was on the deck with the writer Jacques Futrelle. They stood calmly while chaos reigned around. Astor understood that this was the end. At that moment, he ceased to be the landlord of New York. He became simply a man who yielded his place to a woman. The ship went under at 2:20 in the morning. 7 days later, the ship Mackay Bennett found his body. It was disfigured. Legs broken, jaw damaged, body covered in soot. Experts believe that one of the ship's giant smokestacks fell on him when it broke apart. Symbolically, it was the very industry, the very progress in which he so believed, that killed him. In his pockets, they found those same $2,500, gold watch, and cufflinks. The money stayed with him, but it couldn't buy him life. When the news reached New York, it was a shock comparable to the fall of the Twin Towers. The Astors seemed immortal. They were part of the landscape, like the granite rocks of Manhattan. The death of John Jacob Astor IV was not just a family tragedy. It marked the end of an era. Madeline survived. On August 14, 1912, she gave birth to a son. He was named John Jacob Astor VI. The press immediately dubbed him the Titanic baby. But the father never saw him. This death became the point of no return for the dynasty. The head of the American branch passed away without managing to hand over affairs, without preparing heirs. His eldest son, Vincent Astor, who was only 20 years old, found himself one-on-one with the gigantic empire, taxes, and a changing world. Along with the Titanic, not just a man went to the bottom. The confidence that the elite is untouchable sank. The war between Mrs. Astor and the rest of the world lost meaning, because the ocean didn't care whether you had a calling card or were on the 400 list. Caroline Astor had already died by that time, but if she were alive, she would see her world collapsing. Her son's death became the beginning of the end of the great fortune. A new era was dawning. The era of income tax, wars, and the Great Depression. An era to which the pampered heirs, accustomed to fighting only with ball invitations, were completely unprepared. The empire began to list, like that very ship, slowly taking on water, while the orchestra continued to play cheerful music in the empty halls of the Fifth Avenue mansions. They say that the first generation creates the fortune, the second multiplies it, and the third squanders it. In the case of the Astors, this saying worked with frightening accuracy. But there was one more player added whom old John Jacob I did not account for. This player was scarier than any competitor, and more ruthless than any iceberg. He was called Uncle Sam. Just a year after the Titanic disaster, in 1913, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution was adopted in the United States. It introduced the federal income tax, and 3 years later, the estate tax appeared. For the Astor Empire, this became the beginning of the end. The old butcher founder built his system on eternal accumulation. He thought that land would feed his lineage forever. But he did not foresee that the state would decide to take its share. When the first Astors died, the money passed entirely to the sons. But when grandchildren and great-grandchildren began dying in the 20th century, the government took bites of 50, 60, and sometimes 70% from the fortune. This was the mathematics of the curse. Capital melted not because the heirs were stupid, although that too, but because the rules of the game changed. Vincent Astor, the son of John Jacob who died on the Titanic, inherited about $69 million. He was a smart guy, unlike his father. He understood that being a slumlord in the 20th century was bad PR. He began selling off those very dirty tenement houses on which his great-grandfather rose. He tried to modernize the empire. But history was already hurtling downhill. In 1929, an event occurred that can be considered the official funeral of the Gilded Age. Remember that place on Fifth Avenue where the Great War of Two Women began? The corner of 34th Street, the place where Caroline and William's mansions stood, which later turned into the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. In '29, this hotel, the symbol of family enmity and luxury, was sold and sentenced to demolition. It was a grand spectacle. A giant steel ball crushed the walls of the banquet halls where the 400 chosen once danced. Excavators gnawed into the mosaic floors trodden by kings and presidents. People from the street snapped up doorknobs and chunks of marble as souvenirs. The most ironic thing lay in what they built in its place. On the ruins of the Astor's egoism rose a building that became New York's new symbol, the Empire State Building, a skyscraper built on other people's money. The Astor name was literally erased from the map of the world's most prestigious intersection, yielding to an office anthill. And then the Great Depression struck. It struck the Astors not so much in their wallets, they had sufficient reserves, as in their way of life. In a world where people queued for free soup, hosting balls with orchids became not just indecent, it became dangerous. Luxury went underground. The palaces on Fifth Avenue began to stand empty. Maintaining a staff of 40 servants became economic suicide. The great sell-off began. One by one, the Astor mansions went under the hammer. That very double palace of Caroline Astor in the Upper East Side, her final refuge, was sold to developers. It was demolished without mercy. Today, Temple Emmanuel stands in its place. Not a trace remained of the former grandeur. Furniture, paintings, tapestries collected over decades were auctioned off for pennies. The fate of the human capital was even sadder. John Jacob Astor VI, that very Titanic baby, born 4 months after his father's death, became the living embodiment of the clan's degradation. He never worked a single day in his life. He was called Jackie. He spent all his energy on lawsuits against his own stepbrother Vincent, trying to wrest a larger share of the inheritance. Imagine this picture. The grandson of a man who went into the forest to kill bears with his bare hands now sits in a courtroom in an expensive suit, whining that he lacks a couple of million for yacht maintenance. Jackie was a caricature of an Astor. He married 4 times, caused scandals, raced fast cars, but created absolutely nothing. The press no longer feared him. It mocked him. The English branch of the family was also fading. William Waldorf's son, Waldorf Astor II, was a good man, a politician, but his wife, Nancy Astor, the first woman in the British Parliament, dragged the family into political scandals before World War II. They were accused of sympathies with the Nazis, the famous Cliveden set. After the war, maintaining gigantic estates in England became impossible due to the monstrous taxes of the socialist government. In 1966, William Astor, the 3rd Viscount, was forced to transfer the legendary Cliveden estate to the National Trust. The family simply had no money to repair the roof and pay gardeners. The house, bought to prove superiority over the whole world, turned into a museum where tourists are admitted by ticket. This was the finale. By the 70s of the 20th century, from the fortune that once exceeded the US government budget, only fragments remained. Of course, the descendants did not starve. They lived in good apartments, drove good cars. But the magic was gone. There was no power anymore. Vincent Astor died childless in 1959. He understood that the dynasty, in the form envisioned by his great-grandfather, was dead. Therefore, he committed the last, perhaps the most noble act in the family's history. He left all the remaining money, about $60 million, to his 3rd wife, Brooke Astor, with the instruction, spend it wisely. Not on mansions, not on yachts, not on buying titles. Thus ended the story of accumulation, and began the story of giving away. But this was no longer the history of a dynasty of predators. This was an epitaph. The great real estate empire, built on beaver blood and immigrant sweat, turned into a checkbook for charity evenings. The Astors, who once owned New York, now became just another rich name in the Manhattan phone book. The city, which they considered their property, digested them and spat them out, leaving as a memento only the names of subway stations and hotels. If today you fly to New York and ask a taxi driver to take you to the Astor's house, he will most likely bring you to the public library on 5th Avenue. Or to the Astor Place subway station, where on the walls you can still see tile images of beavers, the very animals from which this bloody and golden epic began. The irony of history lies in the fact that from the dynasty that owned almost the entire island of Manhattan, almost nothing remains in the family's ownership. The stone monsters they built as monuments to their greatness have either been demolished, turned into museums, or belong to international corporations. The famous Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the very one born from the nephew's hatred of his aunt, no longer belongs to the family. In 2014, it was bought by a Chinese insurance group for nearly $2 billion. The Astors did not receive a cent from this deal. The St. Regis brand, created by JJ, who died on the Titanic, is now part of the Marriott empire. You can book a room there for $1,000 a night and drink a Bloody Mary cocktail, which, according to legend, was invented right there. But at the next table, you won't meet anyone with the surname Astor. But the curse of money which we talked about at the very beginning, did not disappear with the sale of the mansions. It mutated and caught up with the family already in the 21st century. Remember Vincent Astor, who decided to give away the remnants of the fortune to charity? His widow, Brooke Astor, became the last Mrs. Astor of New York. She was an icon of style, a philanthropist, the soul of the city. She gave nearly $200 million to libraries and museums. It seemed she was able to cleanse the family's karma. But the end of her life became a horrific repetition of Caroline Astor's fate. In 2006, a scandal erupted that shook the entire high society. It turned out that the 104-year-old Brooke Astor, suffering from Alzheimer's disease, lived in horrific conditions in her luxurious apartment on Park Avenue. Her own son, Anthony Marshall, skimped on medicines and doctors for his mother to preserve the inheritance for himself. While the old woman slept on a urine-soaked sofa in a cold room, her son wrote himself checks for millions of dollars from her funds. This was the last trial of the Astors. Brooke's grandson sued his father, accusing him of elder abuse. Anthony Marshall, who was already 85 years old at the time, was sentenced to imprisonment. He went to prison as a decrepit old man. The scenario repeated with frightening accuracy. Money once again destroyed family ties, turning mother and son into victim and executioner. And what about the English branch? Those who fled across the ocean for titles. They survived, but dissolved. Today, one of the most famous descendants of that line is Samantha Cameron, wife of former British Prime Minister David Cameron. She is the stepdaughter of the 4th Viscount Astor. Yes, they are part of the elite. They sit in the House of Lords, they go hunting in Scotland. But these are no longer the Astors who could crash the market with a single stroke of the pen. They became just part of the scenery of British aristocracy, those very boring people from whom their ancestor once fled. The most surprising comparison suggests itself if you look at their eternal enemies, the Vanderbilts. Gloria Vanderbilt, the poor little rich girl, also lost almost the entire fortune. But her son, Anderson Cooper, became one of the most famous and respected journalists in the world. He works every day. He does not use a trust fund. He openly says, "Inherited money is a curse. It kills ambition." It seems the Vanderbilts learned this lesson better than the Astors. So what remains of the Gilded Age? The New York Public Library remains. That very building with lions, founded with money from the first John Jacob Astor. Funny, but the old miser who wiped his hands on the tablecloth and economized on candles left behind the most living and useful monument. Millions of people come there every year for free to read books. Not hotels, not diamond corsages, not Viscount titles, but precisely the library became the only asset that has not depreciated over 200 years. We began our story with a body in the icy waters of the Atlantic, with a man who had a fortune in his pocket but could not buy himself life. We end it with the understanding that all this Game of Thrones in the ballrooms was a great illusion. The Astors spent a century proving that they were better than others. They built walls to fence themselves off from the world. But today, when you walk down Fifth Avenue, you don't see walls. You see the city that swallowed them. The city won. The life of the Astors is perfect proof that it is impossible to own the world. One can only temporarily lease a place in it. And the payment for this lease is often exacted not in money, but in happiness, love, and sanity. The old butcher from Waldorf dreamed of creating a dynasty of kings. He succeeded. He created kings who ruled a world of emptiness until their own crowns crushed them. And perhaps the only truly happy Astor was that very first immigrant who stood on the dirty street of Manhattan with 7 flutes in his pocket and looked to the future with hope, not yet knowing what price his great-grandchildren would pay. for his success.